So good evening. My name is Rob Leyden, and I'm a Director Emeritus here at the Center. I'd like to welcome you to the first Chatham Marconi Speaker Series presentation, Discovering the Cape Cod Shoreline. And Gil will be surveying the marine plants and animals along the Cape shoreline, their ecology, and the diverse habitats in which they're found. Our speaker, Gil Newton, is a Cape Cod native who's been teaching environmental and marine science at Sandwich High School and the Cape Cod Community College for many years. His classes include coastal ecology, botany, coastal zone management, and environmental technology. In 2013, he became director of the Sandwich STEM Academy. He completed his graduate work in biology at Florida State University and has taught classes at Mass Maritime, Falmouth Academy, Bridgewater State University, and the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. At Mass Maritime, he was the program director for Advanced Studies and Leadership program for 14 years. Gil is one of the founders of the Barnstable Land Trust and is the past president of the Association to Preserve Cape Cod. He's the author of several books, including the recent Mysteries of Seaweed, Questions and Answers, Activities for the Cape Cod Beachcomber, Thinking Green on Cape Cod, and the Sandy Beach. Following this presentation, Gil will answer your questions. On your computer, if you're at home, enter your questions at any time by clicking on Q&A at the bottom of your screen and typing them in, and we'll screen them and relay them to our speaker so that everyone in the audience here can also hear them. We may combine similar questions to avoid repetition. And if the folks in the audience would hold the questions until the end of the presentation, we'd appreciate that too. It's now my pleasure to introduce Gil Newton.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, and thank you for coming out on this winter evening. This evening, I'm going to take you on a tour of some of the very rich and interesting habitats in the marine environment here on Cape Cod. And you're going to learn about several of the diversity that we see here of both the plants and animals that exist in our area. I want you to take a look at this first picture, and I think you'll see that if you are a living organism trying to survive in this environment, you have to have evolved a number of adaptations in order to survive. First of all, you have the strong wave action crashing along the shore. You have to deal with a couple of high and low tides every day, making you more vulnerable to changes in temperature and possible predators. The salinity might vary each day. If you have a heavy rainfall, sometimes that fresh water can perch on the surface of the salt water. You may have to deal with changes in the oxygen concentration depending upon the kind of sediments that are present. And don't forget, those sediments are in constant motion as well. So you have to have a way of attaching yourself there. So the reality is there aren't a lot of animals that actually live in this area that we call the intertidal zone. Most of the critters that we see here have washed up from other areas, and that's where we find them along the beach. Other kinds of habitats also exist along the coastline. And let's see, is this working? Nope. Let me try that. Nope. Yes, there it is. It worked. Okay, and this is one of them. You can see it's an open sandy area. You begin to see the presence of a sand dune, which is its own community along the edges, and just beginning to see a little bit of what we call the rack line, some of the seaweed that washes up along the beach there. That is also a habitat for different things. Let's see. Now the rack line becomes much more clearer. And when we say rack line, there's really two species that we often see that wash up along the beach. The most common one, the rack, is actually a species of brown algae called knotted rack. The scientific name is Ascophyllum nodosum. Sometimes we have common names for these, sometimes we don't. But that is a very interesting seaweed. I'll show you some close-ups of it in a minute. And what you often find there are a lot of other tiny animals, tiny critters that attach to the fronds and wash up with them on the beach. One of the experiments I do with my students at the college is we'll go out there, we will collect a fresh sample of it, put it in a bucket, and let it sit for about an hour, and then you can see it's just teeming with life, swimming up and down the water column. Another species that you might find in some areas is eelgrass, and we'll see eelgrass in a couple of minutes. Eelgrass is actually disappearing on Cape Cod. It's one of the species that has been declining over several years. So this is the knotted rack at the canal. And you can see, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. This is the one that has those large air bladders that help it float on the surface. Even though it's an example of brown algae, it actually does photosynthesize. It makes its own food, just like regular plants do. But algae are not true plants. They are missing things that true plants have. They're missing something called vascular tissue, which allows the transport of water and minerals over a long distance. So if you look outside at the trees and shrubs and plants, they have vascular tissue. Algae do not, but they don't need it. They're in the water column, and they basically can absorb whatever that they need. Now, I think I have a nice close-up of this. There you are. You can see the air bladders. And by the way, how many of you out there confess that you used to pop those when you go to the beach? Please don't do that. They're filled with a gas that allows them to float to the surface to maximize photosynthesis. And in places like the Cape Cod Canal, all of those rock armaments along the edges of the canal are covered with this particular seaweed. So in addition to some of the tiny critters that might live amongst the fronds, underneath it you may see a lot of other living things, particularly along a rocky shore. Sponges, sea anemones. In the canal, young larvae of lobsters will live there. Small fish will come in to hide as well. So it becomes a place of attachment, it becomes a place of hiding away from predators, and it's also a food source for a lot of living things. We use this particular plant in many ways. Sometimes I call it the clam bake alga, because for many years this is the species that we used in clam bakes, because it tends to retain moisture. And in states like Maine, they use this for shipping lobsters and clams all around the world for the same reason: it retains moisture. So this is an important plant-like organism along the shore. This is an interesting picture. You can actually see a little bit of the orange sponge being exposed here. This is a very slippery environment too, because one of the advantages of this particular seaweed is that, like I said earlier, it retains moisture. So even at times where it's really warm and it's exposed to the sun, if you were to lift up the fronds, you would see it's much cooler and it's moist underneath. And so a lot of animals like to hide under there, and it helps protect them from desiccation and from harm from the sun's rays. Now this is another kind of rockweed. This is an interesting picture because there's something going on here. Sometimes when you walk along a rocky shore like a jetty, you'll notice that there's a phenomenon we call patchiness. Sometimes the rock jetty is completely exposed and there's nothing growing on it. Other times you might just see one species. It could be barnacles, it could be rockweed, it could be some other species like one of the green algae species, or you'll see some of them together forming like a zonation. But the truth is there's really a competitive activity going on here between the barnacles and the rockweed. And the competition is for space. Whoever gets there first usually tends to dominate that particular environment. So if the rockweed should colonize the area first, the fronds will tend to sweep back and forth in the ocean, kind of like a sweeping or a motion to prevent the larvae from the barnacles having a place of attachment. If the barnacles get there first, they form this incrustation which completely covers the rock surface, preventing the young sporelings of the seaweed getting in there. Sometimes they're cooperative. You can see them growing together like you see in this particular picture. But there's this ongoing competition for space in these limited areas. And there are other factors which affect it too. Wave action, the surface of the rock, what kind of rock material it might be. All of that can affect what you might see along a jetty. Now, I've never given a talk without mentioning my favorite group, and I already have actually, the seaweeds. That was my research area, and that is the area that I like the most. So bear with me for a few minutes here, but how many of you have seen this one? This is a real common seaweed called sea lettuce, and you can see where it gets its name. But did you know that sea lettuce is not only edible, but is more nutritious than garden lettuce? It actually has a certain percent of protein, lots of vitamins and minerals. And that doesn't mean I want you to rush out down to the beach and throw it on your salad tomorrow for a couple of reasons. Ulva, which is the scientific name for sea lettuce, is also an environmental indicator. It tends to grow in areas where there's a high amount of nitrogen runoff. And most of that nitrogen is coming from septic systems. So usually early spring, some of our basin estuaries may be carpeted with sea lettuce, and that's an indication that there's a lot of runoff. Sea lettuce also has a very short lifespan of a few weeks, so there might actually be some living things on it as well. Sea lettuce is used, however, commercially in miso soups and salads and so forth, but it's grown in clean water conditions. If it's really bright green, then it's probably pretty safe to use. If it has kind of a faded green color like this, probably not. So you really have to be careful when you ever collect any of these things out of the wild if you decide to add it to your diet. Here's one we did use for many years, and it's in different stages of decomposition. To the left-hand side where it's bright purple, that's a living plant. And then you notice that it turns white when it dies. This is Irish moss, or Chondrus crispus. It's an example of red algae. There are algae divided up into three main groups, the green, the brown, and the red, based on the pigmentation in their cells. But Irish moss was used for many years in Massachusetts. In fact, there was a big industry here, particularly out of Scituate, where it is used as an emulsifier. Or in other words, it acts as a stabilizer for a lot of food products. So I often ask my students, how many of you eat seaweed? And I'll get maybe one or two hands, the rest of them go, bleh, no, I don't eat seaweed. How many of you have ice cream, Jell-O, puddings, chocolate milk, brush your teeth with toothpaste, and so forth? And of course, almost all the hands go up. Every one of those products has a seaweed product in it, mainly coming from red algae. This used to be the main one. There's now another species that's cultivated that's more common than this. But Irish moss is also can be used to make a pudding. It can be used in bread, and it's a very sweet taste and very nutritious. So this is one that we still will use around here. It tends to grow along jetties down near the base. By the way, that large brown seaweed you see behind it, that is kelp. So not all the seaweeds are positive. Not all the seaweeds are something you want to see along the beach. And this is one that is really, really a nuisance. This is called codium. Some people call it the oyster thief. Some people call it dead man's fingers. But codium fragile is a very invasive species. And I'm willing to bet that most of you have now seen it here on Cape Cod. There are some places on the Cape where this is absolutely choking the beaches. I do some marine science programs for a number of hotels around the Cape, and a number of them have to go down and truck it off the beach early in the morning so their guests can enjoy the beach. I remember I was collecting some seaweeds this month in January one year for my class, and this was over at Dowse's Beach in Osterville, and it was so thick in the water, it was interfering with wave action. Now, codium was introduced into our waters, presumably in the late 1950s, early 60s, on a shipment of oysters that went from Asia up to Canada, down into New England. And for many years, it wasn't a problem, but in the last 10 years, it's really taken over. And it's taken over because it has a lot of those characteristics that invasive species have, one of which is it can reproduce in many different ways. If you were to grab a clump of codium, tear it apart, and throw it back in the water, you now have two. And that's because there are no cross walls between the cells, so it's like one giant cell. Also, the tips have structures on them called utricles, which can release gametes in the water, fertilization takes place, and you've got another codium. But it also can reproduce by releasing the female gametes, and they can grow into a whole new codium without fertilization from the male, a process called parthenogenesis. So it has these different ways, both vegetative and sexually, of reproducing. On top of that, it lives year-round. So you can find it in the winter, you can find it in the summer, and a lot of our native species go through a microscopic stage in the winter, and you don't see them again until the summer. When they try to emerge in the summer, this particular seaweed has taken over their habitat. It's also a problem for shell fishermen because codium tends to grow over the filter-feeding siphons of shellfish and blocks them from feeding. It's very buoyant, so it can remove animals out of the water, and you sometimes will see codium washed up on the beach attached to scallops or oysters or slipper snails or some other animal. So what can you do about it? Well, I use it as a compost. You don't have to wash it, don't have to worry about the salt. I use it in my compost pile. I use it in the winter around my azalea and rose bushes to help protect them in the soil. It breaks apart very quickly. It's very nutritious. There's no odor associated with it. And there isn't a town on Cape Cod that's going to prevent you from taking that off the beach. And on top of that, I recommend you take it from the upper portion of the beach where it's kind of dried out a little bit, because then it's not so heavy, and then you can use it at your home. But even then, you're only going to scratch the surface. Some scientists have begun to look at it as a possible biofuel, maybe as a fertilizer. We're not the only ones with some seaweed problems in this country right now. Okay, so some people ask me, what's the prettiest seaweed out there? Well, you know, it's a matter of opinion, but I picked this one. This is a red alga called dacia or chenille weed. But it also is kind of interesting because dacia, in my first book on seaweeds, I wrote that this was a warm water species, which it usually is. Recently, I had a group of students over at Calmus Beach in Hyannis in late November, and we came across an algae bloom of this particular species. So what does that tell me? It tells me that the water is warmer. Now, we know that from actual measurements anyway, but this is one of the signs that the water is warming up, particularly as we start to see more red algae species replacing some of the cold water brown algae species. Then that's a sign that our ocean is warmer. We may not think it's warm when we see the storm in a couple of days, but overall the temperature is warmer. And this is a pretty one. When you take that out of the water, it just collapses, but in the water you can see all those interesting filaments. Oops. Now, one of the unusual seaweeds is this one. This is called corallina. And this is a particular red alga that actually secretes limestone or calcium carbonate all around its tissues. And it does this to help protect it from animals nibbling on it. But there's still enough sunlight to penetrate those tissues so that it can photosynthesize. This is the only one of its kind we have in Cape waters, but if you go down into the tropics around the coral reefs, they're actually built up by the algae that have this ability to calcify. It's less so in colder water, but they look like little statues around some of the coral reefs in the tropics and subtropics too. All right, here's my favorite. I always have to show this. How many of you have never seen this before? This is one called the sea potato, Lathesia deformis, and it looks like a piece of brown popcorn floating in the water. But it's actually a cylindrical, hollow seaweed that grows on Irish moss and eelgrass in the summer. Goes through a microscopic stage in the winter. Why is it my favorite? Well, it's just so unusual looking. People will bring this to me thinking like an egg mass or something like that. There are some years that you see a lot of it, and other years you don't. So one year, I hadn't seen it for a long time at South Cay Beach in Mashpee, but I knew it used to grow. So I was taking my college group on a field trip one summer evening there, and I said to the students, automatic A for anybody that can find a sea potato for me this evening. Well, I should have looked down first, because within seconds they had handfuls of them. Is this what you're looking for? I go, yeah, that's it. A lot of good grades that evening. But the sea potato I'm seeing a lot more of it. There's actually an imposter in our waters now. There's a much larger one called Colpomenia, which is an invasive sea potato. It's not this species, it's a different one that I've been finding in some of our waters. Another unusual one is called the sea whip. And I think in my book there's a chapter about this. The sea whip is a kelp. Doesn't look like it, but it looks like a long rope or long whip, and the scientific name is cauda. And we're seeing quite a bit of this. Here in Chatham, I often find a lot of this over at the Lighthouse Beach downtown. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about this group, because we really need to know about this group. Those two small organisms you see there are microscopic. They belong to a large group of algae called phytoplankton. And these are examples of a group called diatoms. These tiny microscopic algae, believe it or not, folks, produce most of the world's oxygen supply, at least 50%. Some parts of the year, it's even more than that, because it does fluctuate during the seasons. But this particular group of organisms is extremely important, and they're also how the food web gets kicked off in the marine environment. So ultimately, they support all living things all the way up to the whales. I actually had a bumper sticker made once that said, "Have you thanked a diatom today?" Diatoms also are related to another group, I don't have a picture of them, called the dinoflagellates. And we've all heard about one of them called Alexandrium, which is the cause of red tide. The water doesn't turn red, it has nothing to do with tides. It's simply an explosion, a population bloom of a particular species, Alexandrium, usually in the spring. And it can be a real big problem because it has a neurotoxin which gets concentrated in the tissues of animals like shellfish. Doesn't affect the shellfish, but if you eat it and you get that toxin in your system, you can get something called PSP, paralytic shellfish poisoning. Fortunately, the towns all monitor this very carefully, and it's highly unusual that anybody's going to get sick from it. But you can almost set your watch by it in Nauset Marsh every spring. It's pretty common. This is another plant that we see in the wild. This is a true plant. This is eelgrass. And eelgrass, like I said, does have vascular tissue, which means it has leaves, stems, roots, flowers, fruits, and seeds. It's a very important plant in the subtidal environment. It supports animals like scallops and flounder and blue crabs and lobsters, but it has been disappearing. A lot of research has been done over at the Wacoit Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve in Falmouth in conjunction with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution over the years to try to find ways of controlling nitrogen pollution into the water, because the amount of eelgrass in Wacoit Bay, believe it or not, has declined 99%. And in some parts of the Cape now, it's disappeared completely. It's because of heavy nitrogen loading, which allows the growth of another seaweed, several different species actually, but one in particular called Clodophora, which is a green filamentous species, and that blocks sunlight to the eelgrass beds down below. So they're trying to find ways of controlling the amount of nitrogen to get in there. They're doing some interesting experiments. Some of them have been quite fruitful. Eventually, hopefully, to replant some of the eelgrass beds and bring that back again. This is me peering over a dock at Mass Maritime Academy, looking at the eelgrass, but really trying to find the sea potato. So on land, we also have that dune system, the habitat, and there are a lot of interesting plants that grow along there. Here is another bugaboo. Here's another invasive. This is Phragmites, or the tall reed. A lot of people think this is a pretty plant, very tall. We see a lot of it all over the Cape. But Phragmites actually can outcompete any of the other species. My students have measured that it can grow in waters of salinity up to about 15 parts per thousand, which is about half of seawater. So you often see it ringing around salt marshes. But the best way of controlling it is to open up tidal flow and increase the salinity so that kills off the plant. If you mow it, you cut it, or you burn it, it sends a hormonal signal down to the underground rhizome to grow more plants. It's kind of like, the same thinking when you can get cuttings from plants. You can stimulate growth, same thing there. Salt water does tend to work. And you often see it growing in places where groundwater is coming into the marine environment. Hence, that's why you see it around marshes. We all know this one. This is poison ivy, Toxicodendron. It's got the 3 leaflets. This one shows the berries. All parts of poison ivy have the substance urushiol, which can cause a severe dermatitis year-round. So it loses the leaves in the winter. It's like a little twig coming out of the ground with a little terminal bud. but it can also go as a vine, a woody vine, a shrub. It's very pervasive. But it does have its good side. And its good side is it's a very, very significant erosion control plant. So you often find it growing on sand dunes. Years ago, I probably shouldn't tell you this story, but I will. Years ago, when I was on the Sandy Neck Governing Board in Barnstable, we were debating how do we keep people off the dunes? Okay, because they were riding their bikes and so forth. And I said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, why don't we plant poison ivy? That didn't go over very well. Today, of course, the dunes are loaded with deer ticks, so you'd want to stay off them anyway. But in a way, it makes sense because poison ivy does hold the sand in place. It's a very effective dune control plant. And those berries, by the way, are eaten by over 24 bird species that are unaffected by the substance. So it does have its good side, but we should avoid it. You know, I tell my students, there aren't a lot of things you have to avoid here. You have to avoid ticks, you have to avoid poison ivy, you don't want to go swimming where you see seals, things like that. But when I did my research in North Florida, it seemed like everything there wanted to kill me. There were copperheads and rattlesnakes and alligators and spiders the size of your fist. So we live in a pretty benign environment. Some of the other plants along the dune, this is one people like to put in their gardens. This is Dusty Miller, it's basically, people buy it for its foliage because the flowers aren't much to look at. But it's also a very important dune plant. So is this one. This is Hudsonia, the poverty grass or the beach heather. It's neither a grass nor a heather. And that's also very common. It's one of my favorites. You see a lot of this down in the Marconi area in Wellfleet. It's a very common one there. Here's I would call this somewhat of a controversial plant. This is Rosa rugosa, which is also a very effective dune erosion control plant. But the state of Massachusetts has declared this as an invasive species, and they urge people not to plant it. I, one of my books, humbly disagree with this. I think that this is an effective plant for growing. It does completely colonize an area, but I've seen dunes where it's coexisting with other species as well. It also produces rose hips, which are important wildlife food. It has these very pretty showy flowers. It attracts insects and birds. So I think it has a lot of positive effects. There are other rose variants, like the multiflora rose, which can be extremely invasive. So maybe they're confusing the two, I don't know. This is seaside goldenrod. There are actually over 200 species of goldenrod in the United States. This is an easy one to identify because it grows on the dunes. And a lot of people blame this for their hay fever, but it's not the culprit. Ragweed, which flowers at about the same time, is. Goldenrod's pollen is bee-pollinated, so there's no pollen in the air. And it's a nice one to have along the edge of the dune. And by the way, I'm showing you these dune plants because a dune habitat on the Cape is much more stable when there is a diversity or variety of species. For many years, all we did was plant beach grass in these rows after row after row. And then over a few years, we noticed they started to die off. And that's because when you think about it, we were planting a monoculture. And monocultures attract whatever can eat them and grows like crazy. So it could be a bacterium, a fungus, or whatever. So now we plant a diversity of species. We keep some of the areas open. They call the blowout areas because they also help feed the back part of the dune with sand from the beach. And there are also areas for nesting sites for piping plovers. Here's one we don't want to see in the dunes. This is my last plant picture before we get to the animals. This is called spotted knapweed. Spotted knapweed was introduced into our area from the Midwest. It used to cover thousands of acres that would outcompete some of the wheat production. And it's a pretty plant. It's got that little purple flower. You can see the seed heads. I also like this because of the spider web there. That's kind of cool. But this is really an impoverished plant. And what I mean by that, even though it grows in the dunes, it does very little to protect the dunes from erosion. And the roots release a chemical into the sand, preventing the growth of other plants in the dunes. So I had some students measure this over at Town Neck Beach in Sandwich. And they did 100 1-meter plots all along the dunes where they found knapweed and where they found beach grass. And you know, they found it exactly mathematically an inverse relationship between the presence of this plant and the presence of beach grass. Now, some of the towns, I know Bourne was on, I believe it was Bourne that was involved in an eradication campaign, but you got to pull up the whole thing. You got to pull up the roots and everything, not easy to do. Those seeds, by the way, are viable up to 8 years after they land in the sand. So I've been keeping my eye on this. I see a lot of it in places. If the beach grass gets in there and it's really abundant and there are a lot of other plants, this one has a little trouble getting a foothold, but if there's any little open spaces or whatever, and you often see that, and it can grow right in those. So it's something to keep an eye on. Speaking of invasives, I bet you've seen this one. This is the slipper snail, Crepidula. It exists by the gazillions in beaches. I've taken pictures of this where it just piles and piles up. I did a walk for the Harwich Conservation Trust at Red River Beach, and there's just so many of these everywhere, but they're not alone. Everybody has these. Sometimes you see them in big piles. They seem to be increasing because of the increased nutrients in our water and warmer temperatures. They have that little indentation there, so sometimes they're called boat snails as well. Now, if you've ever found a shell along the beach with a perfectly round hole in it, I wonder what caused that. It's probably this guy right here. This is the moon snail. The moon snail lives under the mud, and it moves along looking for clams and whatever it can find. And when it finds one, it drills that hole through, and then it has a structure called a radula, which is like a tongue with teeth, and it just sucks the meat right out of the clam, leaving behind the empty shell. Moon snails can do a lot of damage to an aquaculture farm or to a shellfish bed. Sometimes along the beaches, you'll see something that looks like a collar made of sand, and it's called a sand collar. It's actually the egg case of this animal here. And you know where I've seen a lot of them? The beaches here in Chatham, over at Chatham Bars Inn and also Lighthouse Inn Beach. That's where I see a lot of them, usually early summer. But moon snails are everywhere. Oops. Now, this unusual structure along the beach is actually an egg case of a large snail called a whelk, which some people call conch shells. At the end, for those of you who are here, I have a sample up here. And if you look inside those parchment, you can see up to maybe a dozen little tiny baby whelks that look just like the large one, which becomes our biggest snail on Cape Cod. I cut one open so you can take a look at that, those of you who are in the audience here. The rest of you might find this at the beach, and sometimes if it rattles, then you look carefully. That's where you can see the tiny whelks. But they often will wash up along the beaches all over the Cape. One of my favorite crabs is this one that we find in salt marshes. This is the fiddler crab, and this is a male fiddler crab. This one is left-clawed. The male uses the claw for a courtship display and for defense. Because I'm tied up here, I can't demonstrate the courtship display for you this evening. But at any rate, the fiddler crab is an important animal in the marsh. It tends to aerate the marsh. It fertilizes it with its waste, and it's a major food source for a lot of animals. We couldn't believe the numbers we saw. I was teaching some kids from Falmouth Academy last summer, and at super low tide over at Chappaquiddick Beach, there were thousands of them. I'm not exaggerating. The kids said it was like a horror movie. They just kind of walk along the marsh, and they're all parted, as they go to the side. By the way, the male, if he loses that claw, will regenerate another one on the other side. So I told my high school group that at the beginning of a week that we were studying, and I said, some are left claws, some are right claws. So they said, well, we're going to count them all week. So they did. They kept records of all the fiddler crabs they found. They got about 200 of them. And do you know it was like 50-50? So not the best scientific study, but still interesting. We also have an interesting animal that is a commercially important one. This is the blue crab, Callinectes. The blue crab is one of the 2 crabs on the Cape that can swim. It's got those little paddles in the back here. Can you see the paddles right there? And those paddles allow it to swim very fast. This is an aggressive animal. This is not one of the crabs you want to pick up lightly. If you do grab it, you want to grab it by the front claws, which means you better be very fast. They can pinch, they can draw blood. They can move their claws all the way behind them. They're extremely fast. If you put one in a bucket and you wave your hand over it, they'll be like this, trying to attack you. There are a lot of other crabs you can pick up easily, but not this one. This one, use a net. Like I say, it's also an edible species, so there's a lot of them collected on the Cape. So here's the mystery. What is this? People find this on the beach. It has the name mermaid's purse, or devil's purse, but this is actually the egg case of a fish called a skate, which is a cartilaginous fish that's related to sharks. And those little hooks wrap around eelgrass, and the waves will rip it off and wash it up on the beach. Sometimes if you're lucky and you see one that's just been released, you can see the young embryo inside. Skates, by the way, are harmless. They look like stingrays, but they don't have a stinger. And there's quite a population of them in a little bit deeper water. Now, one of the big surprises on the Cape is this. This is coral. We do have coral. This is a strangia. For many years, I taught my students that while we have this coral on the Cape, we don't have any coral reefs. That's no longer true. One of the professors at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy many years ago had discovered a coral reef in Buzzards Bay. It's different than the coral reefs in the tropics. You don't see the wide diversity of coral animals and algae. You see mainly this one over a long distance, but it's a coral reef, all right. Coral reefs worldwide are extremely important. About 25% of all marine species visit a coral reef at some time or another. And it was the coral reefs where we first discovered we had a problem with climate change or global warming. Because when the temperature goes up, the coral, which is brightly colored, releases the algae into the water. The algae are the ones that provide the color to the coral, and they provide essential sugars and nutrients to the coral animals. So the coral reefs die back as a result of warmer temperatures. This is a little bit different than that, but nevertheless, we do have it on the Cape. The best place for me, I've collected this, is over in the Woods Hole area, where all those rock jetties are. What's this one? We had to do a rescue operation here. This unusual looking animal that you see right here, which came in on a bed of Heterosiphonia, is the sea cucumber. It's an animal, and a very sluggish animal. It's a suspension feeder at the bottom. This is related to starfish, sand dollars, and sea urchins. It's an echinoderm. And if you were to pick one up, you need to be careful not to disturb it, because one of its methods of protecting itself is to emit portions of its digestive and reproductive system and respiratory system into your hand. It can then regenerate the rest of the system. So you have to be really gentle when you pick them up. About a dozen of them got stranded in this seaweed bloom. So I had some kids and we rescued them and put them out in deeper water. Okay, here comes my favorite one. This is the horseshoe crab. We all have seen horseshoe crabs. What a lot of people don't realize is how important these animals are. So let me take a few minutes here and talk about this animal. First of all, as you pointed out earlier, you pointed out to me, it's not a crab. Horseshoe crabs are more closely related to spiders and scorpions. It's a very ancient animal. It's been on the earth for over 400 million years. Think about that a second. Tyrannosaurus rex walked the earth 95 million years ago. This goes back 400 some million years. The horseshoe crab basically can live anywhere between 20 and 30 years. The animal itself probably can account for its longevity because it has a substance in its blood that when it comes in contact with bacteria, it lyses it. It covers it up, prevents it from being infected. We use that blood. We call this substance LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate. We use that to test all medicine, surgical equipment, vaccines, anything that comes in contact with your blood here in the United States for dangerous bacterial endotoxins. So everything from the flu shot to the COVID vaccine, all of these have been tested with the blood from the horseshoe crab. The horseshoe crabs are collected. They're taken to a few facilities, about 4 or 5 in the country, one in Falmouth where it originated. They take a sample of the blood. They do not kill the animal. The blood is blue, by the way, because it has copper in it instead of iron. And just a little bit of it is enough to detect the presence of those endotoxins. Years ago, if you had surgery, your immune system is depressed after surgery, and you sometimes became more vulnerable to secondary infections, even in a hospital. Today that doesn't happen because of this animal here. They have developed a synthetic form of the LAL in hopes that they will no longer have to take any of the animals. It's now being used, I understand, in Europe, but the FDA is still reviewing it to make sure it is as effective as the real McCoy. They release the animals, by the way, after they have sampled the blood a few days later. They've marked them so they don't recollect it. Still, the numbers of horseshoe crabs have been declining in the United States. Massachusetts last summer passed some stricter regulations, primarily on the handling of them. You never want to pick a horseshoe crab up by the tail or the telson because it's attached to some internal organs. It could damage the animal. When they collect them, they can be out of water for many hours, but they need to stay cool and moist, so they put like a cool cloth over the underside, which is where their book gills are that they respire with. And so there's some other regulations. I think the state of Connecticut banned it altogether. But it is such an important thing for saving human lives. Thousands of human lives have been saved with this animal. By the way, this animal has 10 eyes. It has a pair of compound eyes on the head of the animal, which you can probably make out right here. And then it's got some other eye spots on the back and also a couple of photoreceptors on the tail. They're not eyes like you and I have, but they enable the animal to see all around it as it makes its way in the environment. Combine that with the shell, the ability to avoid infection, its ability to see its surroundings. You can see why this animal has lived as long as it has. So it would be a shame to lose this species. Needless to say, many people are paying attention to this. There's a lot of tagging operations. There's a lot of people watching this animal carefully to make sure that the numbers stay up. My hope is that they'll one day be able to use that synthetic form of LAL and no longer have to take any of the animals out of the wild. When I was a child growing up in Barnstable, I used to see these animals everywhere, particularly in the Great Barnstable Marsh area. A lot less today. I still find them, and I find them here in Chatham as well, but I don't see as many, although last summer I think I saw more than I did the previous summer. So this is an animal to watch. By the way, it's also ecologically important for other species. A female will lay up to 88,000 eggs. Maybe only one of those will survive. But those eggs are a major food source for a lot of migratory birds. One in particular called the red knot, which travels from the tropics up to the Arctic. And that's one of the reasons why we knew horseshoe crab numbers were declining, because the red knot was not making it all the way on its journey. So they're a very, very important food source for a lot of critters as well. This is an important animal. It can't hurt you, it can't bite you or sting you or poke you. You can pick them up, like I say, but hold them like this, never by the tail. It'll probably tickle you if you turn it upside down, doesn't understand why, and is trying to flip itself up. That's what it uses its tail for. If it gets turned upside down, it flips itself around again. You can tell the male from the female. If you look at the upper claws and they look like boxing gloves, that's the male. If they're pincers, that's the female. And if you have them next to each other, you can see the female is much larger than the male. So this is a great and interesting animal. This is a digital picture of jellyfish. This one is the moon jelly. The moon jellies are relatively harmless to us. They do have stinging cells, but you can pick those up. But that's about the only jellyfish you want to pick up. There's one that's increasing in numbers and size, and that's the lion's mane jellyfish. It's kind of orangey. I don't have a picture with me. It's an orangey jellyfish, much larger than the moon jelly, and it stings. And I'm seeing a lot of them on the Cape now, usually in May and June. Early in the summer, late spring, I'm seeing quite a few of them. Saw a lot out here in Chatham as well. Jellyfish worldwide are increasing. They're increasing in their numbers and they're increasing in their size because they are just feeding on all of the nutrients that we're pumping into our oceanic waters. And that's one of the animals that's beginning to replace many others. Here's an animal we are seeing on the Cape more now that we never used to, and that's the Portuguese man-of-war. I collected this picture at a salt marsh in Cotuit about 2 summers ago, and now we're getting reports of this every summer. Both hospitals are reporting stinging visitors from this particular animal. The tentacles can go quite a distance, and by the way, this is not a true jellyfish. This is an animal called a siphonophore. What happens, it has these different polyps along the tentacles that carry on different functions and collectively act as a single organism. So there may be functions of defense or reproduction or whatever, nutrition, but they act as single one. And then this is the sail. It's coming from the Gulf of Mexico, and it likes warm waters. So because our waters are warmer, that's why we're seeing more of these along the beach. Even if you see one washed up, don't touch the tentacles. Those structures are called nematocysts, and they're very, very toxic. They can send you to the hospital. They are that dangerous. This one seems to be missing most of them, so I'm guessing that it either got lost and something ate it, like a turtle or whatever. But I thought it was a plastic bag at first, washing up, and then I got closer and I realized what I had. Another introduced animal, and I bring this one up because this is an animal you can find this time of the year. It's got kind of like a built antifreeze. These are the periwinkle snails. Periwinkle snails are actually introduced into our waters. So it raises the question, when does an animal become native? How long do you have to be here before you're considered part of our waters? I guess people who visit here think the same thing. But this animal is very interesting in the winter because it has different behavior patterns. So I had some students mark them. We went out, we did a mark recapture technique. What we did is we put a little nail polish, red nail polish on a number of them and put them back where we found them. And then we went back day after day for a couple of weeks and did a couple of things. Counted whatever we found, which ones had the nail polish, which ones did not. And we monitored their movement. And the students noticed a couple of things. One, just as you might predict, when the temperature got cold, they huddled together. They found these little crevices and they huddled together. When the temperature was warmer, they became antisocial. They all went off in their own little direction. They tended to hover right near one particular jetty, but we did find some that would cross over to another. And by the way, this method also, you can do some simple calculations and calculate the population size of the periwinkles. So this is an interesting animal to me. It's actually edible. There isn't much there, but in some parts of the world, they use this as a food source. I want you to look at this picture carefully, because this is what we should see at the beach. What should we be seeing washing up on the beach? Driftwood. Please notice the absence of something else, and something I just want to take a minute on my soapbox for this, and that is plastic. We have a real serious problem with plastic in the ocean. To me, this is a problem that is easily solvable. If each and every one of us just became a little more aware. We can't avoid the use of plastics. They're so important in many items, we all know that. But if we could reduce our consumption of some plastics, think about it, and particularly dispose of them properly. Recycle if possible, though very little does get recycled. But try to think it through. We can make a big difference, because right now the ocean is filled with plastic. It's really a very serious problem. One scientist is estimating that by the year 2030, I think it's 2030, the volume and weight of plastic will be equal to that of fish in the ocean. And the other thing about plastics is they tend to break apart into little microplastics, which becomes part of the plankton. So we're now consuming this as well when we eat fish or whatever. And we don't know what the impact of that is. We know plastic can absorb a lot of dangerous chemicals like pesticides, but we have no idea. So we need to really think it through. Again, I'm not calling for a complete ban, but some towns have done things like banning plastic bags, straws, lids, things like that. These are things we can live without and will not affect our lifestyle. So that's all I want to say about that. When we go to a beach, every beach I go to, I find plastic. And I have a friend that ran an ROV up in the Arctic zone in some of the deepest part of the water, and he found plastic. It is everywhere around the world. So we really need to do some more about this. This is a picture I have to show you of my favorite place in the world. This is a pan at Crocker Salt Marsh in Cotuit. A beautiful place. I do a lot of field walks out there for different groups. usually the Barnstable Land Trust. And this is a large pan where it's attached to the creek, which is attached to the bay. There's a lot of critters come in there. I take my students out here, and we also do measurements of both water quality and of the kinds of vegetation along the banks there. But it's really a beautiful spot. And all salt marshes on the Cape are really beautiful. This is the tall cordgrass, which is an extremely important plant. When this dies and decomposes and washes offshore, a whole slew of microorganisms start working on it, passing that energy all the way up the food web. This is easily one of the most important plants we have along our coastline, and it is protected here in Massachusetts. Now, these days, if you go into a marsh, you might be lucky to see one of these. This is a great blue heron, the largest bird that we have. The last few years, they have been overwintering on the Cape. They nest at the top of trees, and they usually see you before you see them. They make a squawking sound that sounds like what I think a pterodactyl must have sounded like. It can really startle you. But they can be just hold perfectly still in the water when they're fishing, and they're really beautiful birds, and we're seeing a lot of them around the Cape now. And then my final slide is this one. And that is, these places are very interesting to me scientifically. I grew up on the Cape as a child. My parents encouraged me to get outside in those days and explore on my own. That's how I got interested in this since I was a toddler. And then I was fortunate to be able to study marine biology in graduate school. But there's something else about the Cape, and that is its beauty. The aesthetics here are wonderful. There's so many beautiful places. Every town on the Cape has these jewels, and every town in the Cape, I think, is doing a good job protecting as much as they can. We need to continue to protect these areas, not just because they're important for us, for our health and for all the things that we feed on, but also for our own peace of mind. They are really, really important areas. So what I would like to do, if I can, I want to show some of the specimens here. So can I walk over? Can I?
Go ahead and walk over and bring them back to where you
Okay, I'm going to do it. For the people on Zoom, I have a table here with some specimens. I just want to bring a couple back, if I can reach them. Now let's start here. You may have to hand me some. I don't want to tear out all the... So, let's see. Can we see this? Can we see this on Zoom, everybody? I'm hoping you can. I know you can see it in the audience here. This is sargassum. This is the seaweed that's a big problem in Florida and the Caribbean right now. And I know there's all kinds of research going on to try to find some uses for this, possibly as a biofuel, maybe as a fertilizer. They know, for example, a lot of farm animals will feed on it as well, but it's not a nuisance on the Cape. It actually comes up on the Gulf Stream. It forms these huge mats offshore in what we call the Sargasso Sea, named after this. And it also carries with it animals like pipefish and seahorses and turtles and so forth. It is a brown seaweed, and it's got these little air bladders as well. So that's an interesting one. Well, I think I've already shown that, so why don't you hand me, let's see, hand me the whelk with the egg case there. That one right there, yeah, hand me that, and then the big shell next to it. Yeah. So this is the whelk I mentioned earlier, the large snail, and this is its egg case. And again, none of you can see that from where you're sitting or at Zoom, but inside these are little tiny ones, and maybe about a dozen each. And this is the knobbed whelk. You can tell because of the bumps along here. We also have a channeled whelk, which is about the same size. There's missing that. By the way, these whelks also have a radula, which can drill a hole, but they can even use their shells as like a hammer to break open their prey. And the seagulls like this, but you can sometimes in parking lots see the broken shells because they grab it and they drop it from a great height and then go down and feed on the animal. And then finally, if you would like to show me one more thing, and that would be the starfish. And I think I'll wrap it up with this. So this is a starfish. We actually call them sea stars now. And I bring this up because this is an echinoderm related to those sea cucumbers. But they're really interesting animals. Everybody knows about a starfish. Behind the starfish are all these little structures that we call tube feet. And what happens is they have a little opening up here called a madrepari, which is like a little orange dot when it's alive. Water enters that, and it goes through a series of canals, and it pumps the water down to these little tube feet. And on the tip of each arm is a red eye spot. And the eye spot says, there's food. Usually a blue mussel or a mussel that it wants to feed. It sends out with a nerve fiber a signal to the rest of the arms to move in that direction. Scientists now believe that this is a head, not a body part, but a complete head of an animal, that it's missing, it's lost in evolution, the rest of it. It's kind of hard to picture, but that's what they're saying. And anyway, when it gets to its food source, which is usually a mussel, it gets into a little tug of war with it, and the sea star is much stronger. All it has to do is pry open that mussel just a little bit, and then something remarkable happens. The stomach comes out of the sea star into the mussel and digests it. So, aren't you glad we don't have to feed that way? But anyway, these animals that I share with you tonight, as well as the plants, are fascinating. There's so many more that we have in the Cape. This is a wonderful place to study marine biology and ecology, because we have, even our small little area, such a diversity of habitats and critters, all of which to me are very interesting. And hopefully tonight you found them interesting as well. Thank you very much. And I will answer questions.
For questions and answers, just a reminder for the folks at home that asking a question is easy. Just click on Q&A at the bottom of the screen, type in the question. What we're going to do is we're going to alternate. If we have questions from here, which I'll repeat, and then questions here, I'll go back and forth. So let's start here. Do we have any questions here? No, that's easy. We have any questions there? Yes, we do. Okay. Well, so Doug said that was very interesting. Did you have a question, Doug?
Maybe I should give a quiz.
Yeah. Nope, I guess Doug doesn't. Okay. Anybody? Yes, go ahead, sure.
What is the seaweed you use in your compost?
Okay, question was, what was the seaweed that's used in compost?
I used the codium, which is that invasive species. The truth is you can use just about any seaweed in composting. They all will break apart very easily. You don't have to worry about the salt. But I don't urge anybody to take any live seaweeds off the beaches where they might be habitats for living things. If you see a whole bunch of things washed up on the beach and they're already decomposing or whatever, use it. It's very useful and very helpful. But codium, you're helping control that invasive, so that's why it's a good one.
How long does it take to decompose?
The question is, how long does it take to decompose?
That varies depending upon temperature, if you mix it in the pile. Along the beaches, of course, in the winter it's going to be much longer. So it's usually temperature dependent. My compost pile is real simple. I just throw leaves and sticks and whatever in a big pile, and just turn it over now and then. But over several years, you start to get some really good soil. So I also use it though, like I said, as kind of like an insulation on the base of some of the shrubs in my gardens. You mix it in with some of the leaf litter and it breaks apart, it's gone by spring. So, yeah.
Mark Patrizzi at home asked the question, how do we get hurricane protection from wetlands?
Say that again, please.
How do we get hurricane protection from wetlands?
Hurricane protection from?
From wetlands as a barrier to hurricanes.
Yes. Oh, good question. Wetlands actually absorb the energy that's coming in from the waves. So, for example, the salt marsh that might have not only the cordgrass, but also might have like an estuary around it. When the tides come in and the waves come in and the wind comes in, it tends to act like a shock absorber. Believe it or not, that helps protect our upland properties. Imagine if you remove that away from the coast. Now, where we live is highly vulnerable to that powerful energy from the ocean. Mm-hmm. This is what happened in New Orleans. Right. Not only did they get hit by a Force 5 hurricane, which was bad enough, not only were they below sea level, but they had removed most of their wetland systems over the years for all kinds of construction. So because of the severity of the storm, it just breached whatever they did have, and now they're rebuilding them again in order to do that. So fortunately, Massachusetts has a wetlands protection law which prohibits any kind of removal of wetland systems or work within a wetland without a permit from a conservation commission. Good question.
Any other questions from the floor? Okay, let me check. Okay.
Have you visited the salt marsh where our transmitter site was?
Okay, so Ed's asking the question, have you ever visited the Forest Beach Road transmitter site where WCC used to have its transmitters?
You mean over in Wellfleet?
No.
No.
No, here in Chatham, in South Chatham.
Oh, no, I haven't.
Okay.
It was a salt marsh.
All
Yep.
right, that will be on my list then. I thought you were referring to the spot in the National Seashore.
No.
Yeah, I have been there many times.
Okay. Check to
Okay.
make sure. Nope. Well, anything else? Anything else from the floor? No? Well, okay. We would like very much to thank you.
Thank you.
And we have for you a logo ball cap, you know, definitely a collector's item.
Good.
A token of our thanks for providing the evening's program for our audience. And thank you very much once again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.